example, about the surviving enclave being bombed, or about what the actual situation was there, how many people were there, and whether civilians there were being targeted. The international media wasn't much better. I was overseas during the war in Gaza at the beginning of the year and was watching CNN and the BBC World Service. And it struck me then that the Israeli military strategy of refusing access to the Western media to Gaza very effectively constrained the coverage that took place. And so afterwards, journalists were able to get in and say, my God, this is terrible, this is a war, this is, the devastation here is shocking, it's a humanitarian crisis. But that was effectively stymied during the conflict by the Israeli army. And it struck me, in fact, that that's where the Sri Lankan army took their lessons from in the conflict in Sri Lanka. They just resolutely refused to allow any access. Now, that didn't stop, of course, images coming out. And there were two instances that struck me at the time. One was photographs that came from UNISAT, the United Nations Satellite Service, which put up, Jake referred to this, images of the bombing that was taking place within the enclave, in which the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister was saying, no, this wasn't taking place. It was a freelance journalist who was working for the International Crisis Group, who put those images up on Reuters AlertNet. AlertNet is a section of the Reuters news agency webpage which hosts news, information, blogs, etc. From the various humanitarian aid agencies. And it was only after that went up there that 24 hours later the BBC took it up and published it, and it was only at that point that in fact the Sri Lankan government said, well yes, actually you're right, we have bombed that area. There was a similar freelance journalist, a group called Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka, which is a group of journalists who have fled the violence in Sri Lanka, and they had footage taken on a mobile phone, presumably, of extrajudicial executions, of which you're about to see some, which possibly are fairly familiar to members of this audience. And again, that footage was available for several days, and it was only when it was actually finally put up on the web by this group that the BBC, again, 24 hours later, put it up. And it survived on their homepage for less than 24 hours before it went off into the archives. Now, other media, two things to say about that. One is that with the new digital media, it is possible to document, to bear witness to a much greater range of events than paid employed journalists of the major news organisations can get to, firstly. But secondly, in some instances that isn't enough, because the mainstream media will still provide a blockage, and it was only well and truly after the event that there started to be some coverage. So I just now want to show you a clip from the Listening Post, which is a discussion forum on Al Jazeera media, and then I'll introduce David Fried.
Back in May, the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, in a military push that killed 20,000 civilians in the last month of fighting alone. We've reported before on how the Sri Lankan government...
Probably accessible on the web. That video, in fact, you might be interested, via Al Jazeera certainly. They keep an archive there. Our next speaker is David Fried. He's an academic here at Monash University, and prior to becoming an academic, and indeed he's been publishing on the situation in Sri Lanka since the early 1980s, but prior to becoming an academic, he worked for 20 years in international development, and a lot of that time was actually spent in Sri Lanka. David.
I wanted to show you a satellite map which shows very clearly how close Sri Lanka and India are. And that's the first point I want to make about the history of Sri Lanka, is its proximity to India. That's the central important fact of Sri Lankan history and geography, is that it's right next to India. And there's been human contact between India and Sri Lanka for thousands of years. You can see there on the map that the distance is relatively short, and it's relatively easy to travel by boat from India to Sri Lanka and vice versa. There was a ferry operating. You can see up here there was a ferry operating at one stage. It ended in the United Nations, but from this island of Rameshwaram to the island of Mannar. And between those two islands there's a string of small reefs and islands that basically link the two places. In terms of the demography of Sri Lanka, under the British colonial period, the British categorised and enumerated the different communities, and according to the census from 1981, the figures for the two main communities are as follows: 74% Sinhalese, 12.7% Ceylon or Tamils, Ceylon or Sri Lankan Tamils, and 5.5% Indian or Plantation Tamils, and 7% Muslims. Now, one of the difficulties about Sri Lanka is that, in a sense, all communities suffer from a minority complex. The Tamils are a minority in Sri Lanka, but the Sinhalese also feel a minority because, in relation to India, where there's some 70 million Tamil-speaking people in the state of Tamil Nadu, the Sinhalese feel a minority. In relation to the South Asian region, the Sinhalese feel they are the small group of people who speak Sinhalese, and they're a very small proportion to South Asians generally. Now, I want to just explain briefly how I became interested in this issue of, in the history of Sri Lanka. And it's that in 1983 I was living in Madras, the capital of Tamil Nadu, and I was carrying out research for a master's degree in Indian Studies at Melbourne University. And I was reading the newspapers every day, and in July 1983 the anti-Tamil riots erupted in Colombo. What happened was that on the 23rd of July, the LTTE ambushed an army patrol in Jaffna and killed 13 soldiers. In response, the army went on a killing spree and killed some 60 people in the northern peninsula. The government response was to take the bodies of the soldiers down to Colombo and hold a state funeral and take the bodies in a parade through the streets of Colombo in a state funeral. That led to an eruption of violence. Tamils were attacked, Tamil businesses and districts were set on fire, and the burning and looting spread to residential areas, and the violence spread. It went on for days. And what was shocking was that the anti-Tamil violence was methodically organised. Tamil homes and shops were systematically targeted by mobs who had electoral rolls by which they could identify which properties were owned by Tamils and which properties were owned by Sinhalese. According to Peebles, a historian, there's no doubt that people within the government planned an attack on Tamils and were using the funeral to instigate it. In some cases, the rioters were led by a government minister, a man called Cyril Matthews. Tamil civilians were assaulted, raped, robbed and killed, and Tamil properties were destroyed. And I was reading about this in newspapers, and the newspapers in Madras were full of stories of these atrocities, and horrific atrocities, stories of people being pulled from train stations or pulled from cars and beaten up simply because of that they were Tamil. The violence spread to the Sinhalese majority areas in other parts of